The wind had teeth. It gnawed through Abigail Reed's worn wool coat, biting at her skin with an animal ferocity that seemed almost personal. Flakes of snow driven horizontal by the gale stuck to her eyelashes and melted against her flushed cheeks. Her fingers, red and nearly numb, fumbled with the flint as she struck it, again and again, against the small pile of bark shavings she'd managed to gather in the growing darkness. "Please," she whispered, her breath forming ghosts that vanished in the wind. "Please." The makeshift shelter, little more than birch bark, leaned against a fallen pine, creaked in protest as another gust threatened to dismantle her meager haven. Inside, bundled in every scrap of fabric Abigail could spare, 18-month-old Charlotte whimpered. The sound cut deeper than the cold. Finally, a spark caught. Abigail bent low, shielding the precious ember, with her body gently blowing until a small flame flickered to life. The orange glow illuminated her face, once soft and full, now hollowed by 3 days of desperate flight. 3 days since she'd discovered the truth about her husband's death. 3 days of running with nothing but a small pack of supplies, a toddler, and the heavy burden of the child growing within her. As the fire strengthened, it revealed a jagged wound on Abigail's forearm, hastily bandaged with a strip torn from her petticoat. The white cloth had bloomed with patches of rust red. She winced as she held her hands to the growing warmth, the thawing bringing its own particular pain. Distant hoofbeats pulsed through the twilight forest. Abigail froze, one hand instinctively moving to her swollen belly, the other reaching for the small knife tucked in her boot, the only protection she'd managed to bring from Dalton. The sound grew closer, then faded as it veered in another direction. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders slumping with momentary relief. She kicked snow over the fire until it died, plunging them back into darkness. Better to be cold than found. She crawled into the shelter beside Charlotte, pulling her daughter close to share what little warmth remained in her body. The child's face was flushed with fever, her breathing quick and shallow. "Mama," Charlotte murmured, her small fingers searching until they found Abigail's face. "Cold." "I know, little one," Abigail whispered, throat tight, "but we must stay quiet, like a game of hide and seek. Can you do that for Mama?" Charlotte nodded, her eyelids heavy with exhaustion. Abigail's mind drifted back to the night that had set this nightmare in motion. She had been organizing Edmund's study, a weekly ritual, since he'd become secretary at the Dalton Town Hall. Edmund, meticulous with his ledgers and correspondence, had always kept his professional life separate from their home. But that night she'd found a hidden compartment in his desk drawer inside notes documenting discrepancies in the town's financial records. Money intended for the regional native tribes' medicine and supplies systematically embezzled. Names, dates, amounts, all in Edmund's precise handwriting. She had been preparing to take the documents to Sheriff Lansing when the note arrived, slipped under their door in the dead of night: "If you want your daughter to live, stay silent and leave town." The next morning, Edmund was found hanging from the oak tree behind the town hall. Suicide, they said. Guilt over his embezzlement, they claimed. A coward's end to a thief's life. A lie. A lie. Abigail closed her eyes against the memory, pulling Charlotte closer as the wind howled a wolf's lament around their fragile shelter. If she survived this night, she would have to find more permanent sanctuary tomorrow. Charlotte couldn't endure much more of this cold. The baby in her womb kicked as if in agreement. "We'll find a place," she whispered to both children, one in her arms, one beneath her heart. "I promise." Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by Charlotte's coughing and the constant vigilance of a hunted woman. When dawn finally broke, a pale, reluctant light filtering through the snow-laden pines, Abigail gathered their few belongings with stiff, protesting fingers. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. Every branch wore a coating of ice that caught the morning sun, shattering it into countless diamonds. Under different circumstances, Abigail might have found it beautiful. Now it was merely an obstacle, deep snow that would slow their progress and leave tracks for anyone determined to follow. "Come, Charlotte," she said, helping her daughter into a small woolen cap. "We need to walk a little more today." "Hungry," Charlotte replied, her usual energy dimmed by fever and fatigue. Abigail dug into her pack, producing their last strip of jerky. "Here, small bites, remember." They set out as the forest awakened around them. Birds called tentatively from snow-laden branches. A fox, rust red against the white, darted across their path before disappearing into the underbrush. Abigail kept them moving west, using the morning sun as her guide. West, away from Dalton. west toward what she hoped might be safety. By midday, the sun had done little to warm the air, but at least it had softened the surface of the snow, making their progress marginally easier. Charlotte had begun to lag her small legs, struggling with each step. Abigail carried her as much as possible, though the weight strained her back and made her own steps uncertain. They were following a frozen creek bed when Charlotte suddenly squirmed from Abigail's arms. "Bunny!" She cried, her voice the loudest it had been in days as she pointed toward movement in the brush. Before Abigail could react, Charlotte was running a surprisingly quick burst of energy that carried her around a bend in the creek and out of sight. "Charlotte!" Panic surged through Abigail as she hurried after her daughter, her boots slipping on the icy creek bed. "Charlotte, stop!" She rounded the bend and stumbled to a halt, her heart lodged in her throat. Charlotte stood a dozen yards ahead, but she wasn't alone. A man towered over her tiny form, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in animal hides with long black hair pulled back from a weathered face. A bow was slung across his back, and at his feet lay a freshly killed rabbit. His dark eyes, set in a face as impassive as the surrounding mountains, studied Charlotte with an intensity that made Abigail's blood run cold. Instead of fear, however, Charlotte looked up at the stranger with open curiosity. The man crouched slowly, bringing himself closer to the child's height. He extended one hand palm up, not reaching for Charlotte, merely offering. In his palm lay what appeared to be a small wooden carving. "Charlotte," Abigail called, her voice sharper than intended, as she rushed forward, snow crunching beneath her desperate strides. The man stood fluid and unhurried as Abigail reached them. She pulled Charlotte behind her, one protective arm extended while the other instinctively curved around her pregnant belly. Up close, she could see the man more clearly. His face bore the distinctive features of native heritage, though perhaps mixed with European blood. A long scar traced the edge of his jaw, disappearing beneath the collar of his hide coat. His eyes, dark but not black as she'd first thought, regarded her with neither hostility nor welcome. "She is safe," he said finally, his voice deep and accented but clear. "No child should wander alone in this cold." "I thank you," Abigail managed, her heart still hammering. "She ran ahead before I could stop her." The man nodded once, then glanced pointedly at Charlotte's flushed face, at Abigail's makeshift bandage, at the exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "You are running," he stated simply, "not a question." "We're traveling," Abigail corrected her, spine stiffening despite her fatigue. "Traveling women bring wagons, provisions." His gaze flicked to the pitifully small pack on her back. "Husbands." Abigail remained silent, weighing her options. This man could be a threat or salvation, there was no way to know which. He shifted his attention to the horizon, then back to the path she'd been following. "There are horsemen 3 miles back, following tracks in the snow." He pointed to her footprints, clearly visible in the pristine white. "Your tracks." Fear, sharp and metallic, flooded Abigail's mouth. "I don't know what you're talking about." She said the lie obvious, even to her own ears. The man studied her for a long moment. "My cabin is 1 mile north," he said finally, gesturing toward a ridge of red stone that rose above the trees. "It will be dark soon. The temperature drops quickly." He bent, retrieving the rabbit and securing it to his belt. When he straightened, he added, "There is food, warmth, for the child at least." With that, he turned and began walking toward the ridge, not looking back to see if they would follow. Charlotte tugged at Abigail's coat. "Mama, look." She opened her small fist to reveal what the man had given her, a perfectly carved wooden rabbit, small enough to fit in a child's palm, the details so fine that even the texture of fur seemed somehow present in the polished wood. Abigail hesitated, torn between the danger of trusting a stranger and the certainty of what awaited them if they continued alone, cold hunger and pursuers drawing ever closer. Charlotte coughed, a wet, rattling sound that decided the matter. "Wait," she called, gathering Charlotte into her arms. "Please wait." The man paused, still not turning. Abigail hurried toward him, each step a choice away from one danger and possibly toward another. When she reached him, he resumed walking, maintaining a pace she could follow despite her burden. "I am Thomas," he said after they had walked in silence for several minutes. "Thomas Running Wolf." "Abigail Reed," she replied, surprising herself with the admission. "And this is Charlotte." Thomas nodded without looking at them. "The fever needs pine needle tea. The arm needs cleaning." Again, not a question. They walked on the snow, crunching beneath their feet in a rhythm that gradually synchronized. Abigail found herself watching Thomas's back, the confident way he moved through the forest, seeming to find a path where none was visible to her. Despite her wariness, there was something reassuring in following someone who knew exactly where they were going. The ridge of red stone grew larger as they approached its surface, catching the afternoon sun in a warm glow that belied the biting cold of the air. Thomas led them along its base until they reached a narrow cleft easily missed if one didn't know to look for it. The passage wound between towering walls of ruddy stone before opening into a small, sheltered valley. Abigail gasped softly at the sight. Nestled against the valley's far wall stood a cabin sturdily built of logs and stone. A thin plume of smoke rose from its stone chimney, dispersing into the clear blue sky. Nearby, a small corral held a single dappled mare, who raised her head at their approach, ear pricked forward with interest. "It's hidden," Abigail murmured, understanding dawning. "The whole valley." "Yes," Thomas said simply. "That is the point." He led them to the cabin's door, opening it without ceremony and gesturing for them to enter. Warmth enveloped Abigail as she stepped inside, so welcome after days of bitter cold that tears sprang to her eyes. The cabin's interior was larger than it had appeared from outside, a single room with a stone fireplace. Along one wall, a wooden table and chairs in the center, and a bed tucked into the far corner. Everything was meticulously ordered, from the cooking implements hanging beside the fire to the furs and blankets folded at the foot of the bed. Thomas moved to the fireplace, adding wood to the banked coals and bringing the fire back to full life. He gestured toward the bed. "For the child," he said. "She needs warmth." Abigail hesitated only briefly before laying Charlotte on the bed and covering her with one of the thick furs. The toddler's eyes were already drooping, her small body surrendering to exhaustion now that it was finally warm. Thomas busied himself at a shelf lined with jars of various sizes, selecting several and bringing them to the table along with a kettle of water. "Your arm," he said, pulling out a chair in clear invitation. Abigail sat cautiously unwrapping the makeshift bandage. The wound beneath was angry and inflamed, a deep gash that ran from her wrist halfway to her elbow. Thomas's expression didn't change as he examined it, but something in his eyes darkened. "Knife," he stated, "not accident." Abigail looked away. "It doesn't matter. It matters to infection." He began cleaning the wound with a cloth soaked in a pungent herbal solution. His touch was surprisingly gentle for hands so large and weathered. 3 days without cleaning. Dangerous. Abigail winced as he worked but didn't pull away. "I had limited options." He nodded once, acknowledging the truth of this. When the wound was clean, he applied a greenish salve that smelled of pine and something earthier, then wrapped it with a clean strip of cloth. "Rest," he said, standing and moving toward the door. "I will prepare food." Left alone with the sleeping Charlotte, Abigail allowed herself a moment to simply breathe. The cabin's interior revealed more about its owner upon closer inspection. Shelves along one wall held books, not many, but more than she would have expected. A workbench beneath the single window was scattered with wood shavings and carving tools. Hanging from the ceiling beams were dozens of dried herbs and plants carefully bundled and labeled in a script she didn't recognize. Most telling, though, was what was missing: any sign of family or companions. No extra bedding, no children's toys, save those he evidently carved himself, no feminine touches to soften the utilitarian space. Thomas Running Wolf lived alone and had for some time. The door opened and Thomas returned with the rabbit already skinned and cleaned. He set to work at the fireplace preparing a stew with practiced efficiency, adding roots and dried herbs from his stores. Neither spoke as he worked, the silence broken only by the crackling fire and Charlotte's steady breathing. When the stew was simmering, Thomas finally turned to face Abigail fully. "Why do men follow you?" he asked bluntly. Abigail stiffened. "I told you I don't know." "Do not waste lies," he interrupted, his tone not unkind but firm. "I have offered shelter, food, not questions about why you run or from whom. But if men come here," he glanced meaningfully at Charlotte, "I must know what danger follows you." Abigail studied him, weighing her options. This man had shown them only kindness, but trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. Still, he deserved some truth if he was risking his home to shelter them. "My husband was killed," she said finally, each word measured. "They made it look like suicide, made it seem he had stolen money meant for native tribes." She watched Thomas's face carefully as she mentioned the tribes, but his expression remained impassive. Before he died, he left evidence that could expose the real thieves. Powerful men. They think I have this evidence or know where it is. Do you? Thomas asked. No, Abigail admitted, but they won't believe that. Thomas nodded slowly. So you run. So I run, she echoed. For her. She glanced at Charlotte. And for this one. Her hand rested on her belly. Something flickered in Thomas's eyes, recognition perhaps, or memory. He turned back to the stew, stirring it slowly. You will stay tonight, he said. Tomorrow we will see what tracks the snow reveals. Abigail's shoulders sagged with relief. Thank you. Thomas served the stew in wooden bowls along with a tea he had brewed from pine needles and something that smelled of honey. For the fever, he explained, nodding toward Charlotte. When she wakes. They ate in silence, the rich broth warming Abigail from within. It was the first proper meal she'd had since fleeing Dalton, and she had to resist the urge to eat too quickly. Thomas, she noticed, ate methodically, his movements economical and precise, a man accustomed to solitude and its rituals. After they had eaten, Thomas took his bow and moved toward the door. I will check the perimeter, he said. Make sure no one approaches the valley unseen. When he had gone, Abigail finally allowed herself to fully relax, the events of the past days catching up to her all at once. She moved to the bed, curling herself protectively around Charlotte, and was asleep almost instantly. She woke sometime later to the sound of soft humming. Opening her eyes, she saw Charlotte sitting on the floor near the fire, watching with rapt attention as Thomas carved a piece of wood with a small knife. The melody he hummed was unfamiliar to Abigail, something low and rhythmic with a melancholy that seemed to reach back through generations. Charlotte held her wooden rabbit in one hand, occasionally mimicking Thomas's carving motions with her other hand. Her color was better, the flush of fever receding. She woke while you slept, Thomas said without looking up, aware of Abigail's consciousness without seeing it. Drank the tea. Fever is lower. Thank you, Abigail said, sitting up slowly. Outside, darkness had fallen completely, the cabin's windows reflecting only the interior firelight. Thomas nodded, continuing his work. In his hands, a formless piece of pine was gradually taking the shape of a bird, an eagle. Abigail thought, noting the proud curve of the beak emerging from the wood. You're very skilled, she observed. Thomas's hand stilled momentarily. My father taught me, he said, resuming his work. Before the wars. Charlotte scooted closer to Thomas, her curiosity overcoming any shyness. Bird, she asked, pointing to the emerging carving. Eagle, Thomas confirmed. Protector spirit of my people. He turned the carving so Charlotte could see it better. In our stories, eagle carries souls to the stars when their time on earth is done. Like heaven? Abigail asked. Thomas shrugged. Different words, same journey. Charlotte reached out tentatively, touching the wooden eagle's forming wing. Ish, she began, struggling with a word. Thomas's eyebrows rose slightly. Ish-K, he said slowly. It means child in Apache. Ish-K, Charlotte repeated, grinning with the accomplishment. For the first time, Abigail saw something like a smile touch Thomas's lips, brief but unmistakable. Good, he said to Charlotte. Quick learner. Later, after Charlotte had fallen asleep again, Thomas and Abigail sat at the table, a cup of fragrant tea before each of them. The fire had burned low, casting the cabin in a warm golden glow that softened the angles of Thomas's face. Why do you live here alone? Abigail asked, breaking the companionable silence that had settled between them. Thomas didn't answer immediately, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup. Safety, he said finally. Solitude. From what? His eyes met hers, something ancient and wounded in their depths. The past. He took a sip of his tea, then added, We all run from something, Mrs. Reed. Abigail, she corrected automatically. And yes, I suppose we do. Thomas studied her across the table. Your husband, but he began, his tone careful. He discovered the theft from tribal funds. Abigail nodded. Edmund was secretary to the town council. He noticed discrepancies in the ledgers, money allocated for medicine, food blankets for the reservations. None of it ever reached the tribes. She twisted her wedding ring, a simple gold band that was one of the few valuables she hadn't sold to fund their escape. He was gathering evidence, documenting everything. Then one day her voice faltered. He was silenced, Thomas finished for her. Yes, Abigail blinked back tears. They made it look like he'd stolen the money himself, then taken his own life out of shame. But Edmund would never. She shook her head firmly. Never. Thomas nodded, accepting her certainty without question. And now they hunt you thinking you have his evidence. Or know where it is? Abigail sighed. But I don't. I found some of his notes after they found him, but nothing that would prove who was really behind it all. Thomas rose, moving to the fireplace to add another log. The flames leapt higher, casting his profile in sharp relief against the stone. Sleep, he said, his back still to her. You are safe tonight. Something in his tone, a certainty, a promise, eased the knot of tension that had resided in Abigail's chest for days. She returned to the bed, settling beside Charlotte, and watched as Thomas spread a bedroll near the fire. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was his silhouette seated cross-legged on the floor, head bowed as if in prayer or remembrance. The next few days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Thomas would rise before dawn, checking the valley's perimeter and hunting if needed. Abigail, waking to the smell of coffee, a luxury she hadn't expected in this remote cabin, would tend to Charlotte and help prepare breakfast. After the first night, Thomas insisted they take the bed while he continued to sleep by the fire. The wound on Abigail's arm began to heal under Thomas's care, the angry red fading to a duller pink. Charlotte's fever disappeared completely, her natural energy returning with a vengeance that transformed the cabin's quiet order into something more chaotic but also more alive. To Abigail's surprise, Charlotte took to Thomas, immediately following him around the cabin and watching his every move with fascination. Even more surprising was Thomas's patient acceptance of this attention, answering Charlotte's endless questions with a gravity that suggested he found them genuinely worth consideration. On the third day, as a light snow fell outside, Thomas began teaching Charlotte simple Apache words, animal names, colors, basic greetings. The toddler absorbed them eagerly, delighting in the new sounds and in Thomas's quiet approval when she pronounced them correctly. She has a gift for language, Thomas observed as Charlotte napped later that afternoon. Like her mother. Abigail looked up from the mending she was doing, repairing a tear in Charlotte's coat. How would you know I have a gift for language? Thomas nodded toward the shelf of books. You read the titles. Your eyes linger on the Apache texts, trying to decipher them. Abigail felt her cheeks warm at being so transparent. I've always loved learning, she admitted. My father was a school teacher before the war. He taught me Latin, some Greek, said education was the one thing no one could take from you. Wise man, Thomas said. He hesitated, then added, I could teach you some Apache words, if you wish. The offer, so tentatively extended, touched Abigail deeply. I would like that very much. That evening, as the snow continued to fall in gentle, unhurried flakes, Thomas brought out a worn leather journal and began writing Apache words and their English equivalents. His handwriting was careful but unpracticed, each letter formed with deliberate precision. You learned to write late, Abigail observed. Thomas nodded. Mission school, age 12. His jaw tightened slightly. They did not approve of Apache there. Abigail sensed the weight behind those simple words, histories of loss and forced assimilation that she could only begin to imagine. I'm sorry, she said, inadequate but sincere. Thomas shrugged. It was long ago. He turned the journal toward her. This word ta means just or only, but also truly. Context matters. They continued for an hour, the sounds of Apache filling the cabin as Thomas guided Abigail through basic pronunciations. Charlotte, awakened from her nap, sat on Abigail's lap, occasionally mimicking the words with impressive accuracy. When they finished the lesson, Thomas closed the journal but didn't put it away. Instead, he opened it to a blank page and handed it to Abigail along with a pencil. Write your story, he said. What happened in Dalton? Everything you remember about your husband's discovery. Abigail stared at the blank page. Why, because memory fades, Thomas replied, and truth should not be lost. Sensing her hesitation, he added, I will take Charlotte to feed the horse. You will have privacy. After they had gone, Abigail sat with the empty page before her, pencil hovering uncertainly. She hadn't allowed herself to fully revisit the events leading to Edmund's death. Survival had demanded forward momentum, not reflection. But Thomas was right. The details were already beginning to blur at the edges, and the truth of what happened to Edmund deserved preservation. Slowly at first then, with increasing fluency, she began to write. The irregularities Edmund had first noticed in the ledgers, his growing suspicion of Mayor Hollister and Judge Parker, the secret meetings with Samuel Morgan, his colleague at the town hall who had shared his concerns. The day Edmund had discovered that the embezzled funds meant to provide vital supplies to tribes already devastated by broken treaties had been used to invest in a new railroad venture that would further encroach on tribal lands. And finally, the morning she had found him hanging from the oak tree, his feet barely off the ground, in a way that had always seemed wrong to her, as if someone of Edmund's height should have been higher if he had truly jumped from the branch above. When Thomas and Charlotte returned rosy-cheeked from the cold, Abigail had filled nearly 10 pages. She closed the journal, suddenly protective of the raw emotion she had poured onto its pages. Thomas didn't ask to read what she had written, merely nodded as she handed the journal back to him. "Good," he said simply, tucking it into a shelf near his workbench. That night, after Charlotte was asleep, Abigail found herself restless. The act of writing had stirred memories and emotions she had been suppressing, leaving her mind too active for sleep. She rose quietly, wrapping one of Thomas's blankets around her shoulders, and moved to the cabin's small porch. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the night sky revealed itself in all its winter glory. Stars crowded the blackness, brilliant and countless, while a full moon transformed the snow-covered valley into a landscape of silver and shadow. Abigail's breath formed clouds that dissipated into the still, cold air. She didn't hear Thomas join her, only sensed his presence as he stood beside her, his own gaze lifted to the stars. "I sometimes wonder if I'm doing the right thing," Abigail said softly, breaking the silence. "Running away instead of standing my ground." Thomas didn't immediately respond, his profile strong and still in the moonlight. "Sometimes," he finally said, "the greatest courage is knowing when to retreat." And the simplicity of the statement, delivered without judgment or platitude, eased something in Abigail's heart. They stood in companionable silence, watching the moon cast its light across the valley. From somewhere in the distant forest, a wolf's howl rose long and mournful, echoed moments later by another. Thomas spoke quietly in Apache, the words flowing like water over stone. "Was that a prayer?" Abigail asked. "A promise," Thomas replied, "to those who have gone ahead." Abigail thought of Edmund, of the life they had planned together, of the future that had been stolen from them. "Does it get easier?" she asked. "The loss." Thomas considered this, his breath forming and dissolving in the moonlight. "Not easier," he said finally. "Different, like a river changing course after a storm. It still flows but finds new paths." The wolf howled again, closer this time. Thomas straightened, suddenly alert. "Inside," he said, his tone shifting from philosophical to practical in an instant. "Quickly." Once they were back in the cabin, Thomas secured the door and moved to the window, peering out into the moonlit night. His body had tensed, reminding Abigail that beneath his calm exterior was a man accustomed to vigilance. "What is it?" she asked, keeping her voice low to avoid waking Charlotte. "Horses," Thomas replied. "2, maybe 3 riders, moving along the ridge." Fear, momentarily forgotten during their peaceful days in the cabin, surged back through Abigail's veins. "Do you think they've tracked us here?" Thomas shook his head. "No, the valley entrance is hidden, and I've been careful to sweep away tracks in the snow." He continued to watch through the window. "They are searching, but blindly." Relief mingled with renewed anxiety in Abigail's chest. What if they find the entrance to the valley? "They won't," Thomas said with quiet certainty. "But if they do..." He moved to a trunk beside his workbench and opened it, revealing a Winchester rifle nestled in an old blanket. "I am prepared." Abigail's eyes widened at the sight of the weapon. Not because it existed. Most households in this territory kept firearms for hunting and protection, but because of what it represented, Thomas was willing to defend them, perhaps at great personal risk. "Why?" she asked, the question escaping it before she could reconsider it. "Why would you risk yourself for us? You barely know us." Thomas closed the trunk, his movements deliberate. "I know enough," he said simply. Before Abigail could press further, a sharp knock at the door froze them both. Thomas motioned for her to move back away from the door and into the shadows, then retrieved the rifle from the trunk. With it held ready but not raised, he approached the door. "Who comes in darkness?" he called, his voice steady. "It is Joseph," came the reply, the voice aged but strong. "The north wind brings cold counsel." Thomas's shoulders relaxed marginally. He lowered the rifle and opened the door, revealing an elderly man wrapped in furs, his weathered face lined with exhaustion. Snow clung to his long gray hair and the shoulders of his coat. "Joseph Blackfeather," Thomas said, stepping aside to allow the man entry. "What brings you through the pass in winter?" The old man stomped snow from his boots before entering. "Necessity, nephew. Not choice, das." His dark eyes, sharp despite his age, immediately found Abigail in the shadows. "And who is this who shelters with the wolf?" Thomas closed the door, securing it once more. "Abigail Reed and her daughter Charlotte," he said, switching to English. "They needed sanctuary." Joseph shed his outer furs, hanging them near the fire to dry. He spoke rapidly to Thomas in Apache, the words flowing too quickly for Abigail to catch any she might have recognized from their lessons. Thomas responded in kind, his voice low but intense. Abigail understood none of the words, but the tone was clear enough. Joseph was warning Thomas about something, and Thomas was defending his decision to shelter Abigail and Charlotte. Finally, Joseph sighed and switched to English. "Forgiveness, Mrs. Reed. An old man's caution. These are dangerous times." "Please call me Abigail," she replied, stepping forward into the firelight. "And I understand caution. It's why we're here." Joseph studied her with eyes that seemed to see beyond surfaces. "Yes," he said finally, "I believe it is." He glanced at the bed where Charlotte still slept, oblivious to the tension in the room. "The child is yours, of course, and—" His gaze dropped to Abigail's swollen belly. "Another comes soon." Abigail nodded, one hand moving protectively to her abdomen. "In 2 months, God willing." Joseph turned back to Thomas. "You have chosen a complicated path, nephew." Thomas's expression remained impassive, but something in his eyes hardened. "I have chosen nothing. They needed help." Joseph shrugged, a gesture that somehow contained volumes of meaning. "As you say." He moved to the fire, warming his hands. "I bring news, but it will wait until morning. An old man needs rest after such a journey." Thomas prepared a bedroll for Joseph near the fire opposite his own. The old man eased himself down with the careful movements of one whose joints protested such treatment. Soon his breathing deepened into sleep, leaving Thomas and Abigail the only ones awake in the cabin. "Who is he?" Abigail asked quietly as Thomas checked the door one final time. "My mother's cousin," Thomas replied. "Elder of what remains of our band. He lives with the Wind River tribe now, but it travels between communities." "He doesn't approve of us being here," Abigail observed. Thomas's mouth quirked in what might have been a suppressed smile. "Joseph disapproves of most things. It is his nature." He nodded toward the bed. "Sleep. Morning comes early, and Joseph rises with the sun." Abigail returned to the bed, settling beside Charlotte, but sleep eluded her. Questions circled her mind like restless birds. Who were the riders on the ridge? What news had brought Joseph through a mountain pass in winter? And most persistently, what had Joseph meant when he said Thomas was choosing a complicated path? When exhaustion finally claimed her, Abigail dreamed of Edmund, not as she had last seen him, still and cold beneath the oak tree, but as he had been in life, his eyes bright with purpose as he bent over his ledgers. In the dream, he looked up at her and spoke, but his words were in Apache, unintelligible, yet somehow urgent. She woke to the scent of coffee and the low murmur of voices. Dawn had barely broken the cabin's interior, still more shadow than light. Joseph and Thomas sat at the table, speaking quietly in Apache. Charlotte, already awake, sat on Joseph's lap, fascinated by the bone necklace he wore. As Abigail rose, both men turned toward her. Joseph said something that made Thomas frown, though he didn't contradict the older man. "Good morning," Abigail said, smoothing her hair self-consciously. After days on the run, followed by their time in the cabin, she was acutely aware of her disheveled appearance. "Morning brings truth into light," Joseph replied cryptically. He bounced Charlotte gently on his knee, earning a giggle from the toddler. "This one has her father's eyes, I think." The observation, so casually delivered, sent a chill through Abigail. "You didn't know my husband?" she said, the statement part question. Joseph's weathered face revealed nothing. "Many paths cross in a long life, Mrs. Reed." Before Abigail could press further, Thomas intervened. "Joseph brings news from the south," he said, pouring coffee into a cup and offering it to Abigail. "Riders have been seen asking questions in several settlements. 2 white men and a half-blood tracker." Abigail's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the coffee. "Looking for us. Looking for a woman and child traveling alone," Thomas confirmed. They offer money for information. Bounty hunters? Abigail said the word bitter on her tongue. Joseph shook his head. Most ordinary bounty hunters. One wears the badge of the territorial marshal. Another is well-dressed a town man. The third, he glanced at Thomas. The third is Victor Holloway. Thomas's expression darkened at the name. You're certain? Joseph nodded grimly. I saw him myself in Wind River. He asked many questions about strange travelers. Who is Victor Holloway? Abigail asked, sensing the weight this name carried between the two men. A hunter of men, Thomas replied, his voice flat. Mixed blood like me, but he uses his knowledge of both worlds to track those who don't wish to be found. He worked for the army during the wars, hunting those who left the reservations. And now he hunts us, Abigail said quietly, glancing at Charlotte, still happily playing with Joseph's necklace, blissfully unaware of the danger closing around them. Perhaps, Joseph said, but it is curious. Victor does not usually work with lawmen. Thomas rose, moving to the window to scan the valley. Curious or not, if Holloway is tracking them, this valley won't remain secret for long. He turned back to Abigail. You should know Victor and I have history. Bad blood. What kind of history? Abigail asked. Thomas and Joseph exchanged a look laden with unspoken meaning. It was Joseph who answered. They were scouts together, for the army, until Fort Laramie. What happened at Fort Laramie? Abigail pressed. Thomas's jaw tightened. Another time, he said, the finality in his tone closing the subject. Now we must prepare. If Holloway is involved, we need to be ready to move quickly. The rest of the morning passed in a flurry of practical activity. Thomas checked and cleaned his rifle, then disappeared into a small root cellar beneath the cabin floor, returning with dried meat pemmican and other provisions that could be easily transported. Joseph took Charlotte outside to visit the horse, keeping her occupied while the adults prepared. Abigail helped where she could, packing her few belongings and assisting Thomas in preparing travel provisions. As they worked side by side at the table, Thomas finally spoke about what had been weighing on his mind. You asked last night why I would risk myself for you, he said, not looking up from the pemmican he was wrapping in wax cloth. The truth is, I made a promise long ago to help those who needed sanctuary. After what happened to my own family, I swore I would not turn away those in danger. Abigail paused in her work. What happened to your family, Thomas? For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, with hands that continued their methodical work, he told her, My wife Anaba and our son Noshi were killed 3 winters ago. Not by sickness, as some believe. They were murdered while I was away hunting. A message, they said, for my betrayal at Fort Laramie. What betrayal? Abigail asked softly. Thomas tied off the package of pemmican with more force than necessary. I refused to lead soldiers to a camp of my own people who had left the reservation searching for food. The commander wanted to make an example of them. His voice hardened. I would not be part of another massacre. So you left the army, Abigail said, understanding dawning. That's why Joseph called you nephew, but spoke to you as an equal. You were away from your people for some time. Thomas nodded once. The army trained me as a scout, taught me to read maps, track in all conditions, speak English better than most of my people. Useful skills. His mouth twisted, until conscience made them inconvenient. Abigail reached across the table, placing her hand over his in a gesture of solidarity. I'm so sorry about your family, Thomas. He didn't pull away from her touch, but his expression remained guarded. Sorrow changes nothing, he said. Actions matter. Before Abigail could respond, the cabin door burst open and Joseph hurried inside with Charlotte in his arms. Riders, he said tersely, coming up the valley path. 3 of them. Thomas moved immediately to the window, rifle in hand. How did they find the entrance? He muttered, more to himself than to the others. Someone talked, Joseph said grimly. Money loosens many tongues. Thomas turned to Abigail, his decision already made. Take Charlotte to the root cellar. There's a tunnel that leads to a cave higher up the ridge. Joseph will show you. What about you? Abigail asked, fear clutching at her throat. I will meet them, Thomas said, checking his rifle one last time. Learn what they want. It's too dangerous, Abigail protested. If it's Victor Holloway, then I face an old debt, Thomas interrupted. Go now, quickly. Joseph handed Charlotte to Abigail and moved to the cabin floor, lifting a trap door cleverly disguised as part of the wooden planking. This way, he said, gesturing to the dark opening. Bring only what you can carry easily. Abigail hesitated, torn between the need to protect Charlotte and her unwillingness to leave Thomas to face the danger alone. "Thomas, go," he repeated, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that brooked no argument. "I will find you when it's safe." Clutching Charlotte to her chest, Abigail descended into the root cellar, Joseph following behind with a small oil lamp. As the trapdoor closed above them, sealing them in musty darkness, Abigail heard the unmistakable sound of horses approaching the cabin. Joseph led them through the cellar to a narrow passage cut into the earth and supported by timber frames. "Stay close," he whispered. "The path is not straight." As they moved deeper into the tunnel, the sounds from above faded, replaced by the soft drip of water and their own careful footsteps. Charlotte, sensing the gravity of the situation, remained unusually quiet in Abigail's arms. Abigail's thoughts, however, were anything but quiet. They raced back to the cabin, to Thomas standing alone against unknown enemies, to the rifle in his hands and the determination in his eyes. For a man who had chosen solitude, who had already lost so much to risk himself for her and Charlotte, the weight of that sacrifice pressed against her heart like a stone. The tunnel curved upward, the footing becoming more treacherous as they climbed. Joseph moved with surprising agility for his age, one hand holding the lamp, the other occasionally reaching back to steady Abigail. "Nearly there," he murmured as the passage widened slightly. "The cave opens just ahead." Before they could reach it, however, the ground beneath them trembled. A distant report, the unmistakable sound of a rifle shot, echoed through the tunnel. Abigail froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. "Thomas," she whispered, the name a prayer and a plea. Joseph paused, his aged face grim in the lamplight. "We must continue," he said firmly. "Whatever happens, the children must be safe." The children. In that moment, with one hand supporting Charlotte and the other pressed against her swollen belly, Abigail understood the terrible clarity of Joseph's priorities. Whatever her feelings, whatever her fears for Thomas, her first duty was to protect her children. With a nod that contained both acceptance and grief, she followed Joseph toward the cave and whatever uncertain future awaited them beyond. I'll now write part 2, 7,000 words of the story, continuing where part 1 left off while maintaining the same cinematic emotional style and pacing. The cave opened like a mouth in the red stone face of the ridge, its entrance partially concealed by scraggly pine and juniper that had somehow found purchase in the rocky soil. Joseph led Abigail to this threshold between earth and air, his weathered hand still steady on the oil lamp that cast long shadows against the tunnel walls. "Wait," he whispered, motioning for Abigail to stay back as he moved forward to survey the terrain outside. Abigail pressed herself against the cool stone, Charlotte quiet and watchful in her arms. The child seemed to understand instinctively that silence was necessary, her small fingers clutching the wooden rabbit Thomas had carved for her. The distant echo of the rifle shot still reverberated in Abigail's mind, a single terrible note that could mean anything or everything. Joseph returned moments later, his expression revealing nothing. "The way is clear," he said, "but we must move quickly. Follow the ridge north, staying beneath the tree line." "What about Thomas?" Abigail asked, the question escaping before she could contain it. Joseph's dark eyes, deep set in a face lined by decades of sun and wind, softened slightly. "Thomas Running Wolf knows how to survive," he said. "Our task now is to ensure you do the same." Emerging from the valley, they found themselves on a narrow ledge halfway up the ridge. Below, the valley spread out in pristine white, the cabin, a small dark shape in its center. 3 horses were tethered outside, confirmation that whoever had fired that shot was still there. Abigail scanned the scene desperately for any sign of Thomas, but at this distance, she could see no movement around the cabin. Fear and uncertainty knotted in her stomach, but she forced herself to focus on the immediate task, following Joseph along the treacherous ridge path. They moved north as quickly as conditions allowed, Joseph leading the way, with the sureness of one who had walked these mountains for a lifetime. Abigail followed, grateful that Charlotte remained unusually compliant in her arms, despite the child's normal boundless energy. The weight of her daughter, combined with the growing burden of her pregnancy, made each step an exercise in determination. "Where are we going?" Abigail asked when they paused for breath in the shelter of a wind-twisted pine. "There is another cabin," Joseph replied, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Smaller, a hunting lodge Thomas built when he first came to these mountains. Few know of it." "How much farther?" Joseph gazed at the path ahead, calculating. 2 hours, perhaps 3 in this snow. Abigail nodded, adjusting Charlotte's weight in her arms. The child was heavy, but the alternative, setting her down to walk in the deep snow, would be slower and more dangerous on the narrow ridge path. I can carry her for a while, Joseph offered, noting Abigail's fatigue. Abigail hesitated. Charlotte, normally shy with strangers, had taken to Joseph with surprising ease, but Abigail was reluctant to relinquish the comfort of holding her daughter close. Just for a little while, Joseph said gently. Whoop your strength for the child you carry within. Recognizing the wisdom in his words, Abigail carefully transferred Charlotte to Joseph's waiting arms. The old man adjusted her weight with practiced ease, murmuring something in Apache that made Charlotte smile despite the tension of their situation. They continued along the ridge, the sun climbing higher in a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at it. The beauty of the landscape, pristine snow against red stone pine trees laden with white distant mountains sharp against the horizon, stood in stark contrast to the danger that had driven them here. Joseph, Abigail began, after they had walked in silence for some time. What did you mean when you told Thomas he had chosen a complicated path? The old man's pace didn't falter, but something in his posture suggested he had been expecting this question. Thomas Running Wolf has walked between worlds all his life, he said. Son of an Apache mother and a white trapper father, go out for the army that hunted his own people. A man with one foot in each world often finds himself belonging to neither. That doesn't answer my question, Abigail pressed. Joseph glanced at her, a hint of approval in his eyes at her persistence. No, it does not. He adjusted Charlotte in his arms, the child now dozing against his shoulder. When Thomas lost his family, he made a vow of solitude. He turned away from both worlds, seeking only silence and forgetting. Until we arrived, Abigail said softly. Joseph nodded. Until you arrived, a white woman with a child hunted by powerful men. By sheltering you, Thomas risks drawing attention not just to himself but to our people. The army has not forgotten Fort Laramie, or his desertion. The implications settled heavily on Abigail's shoulders. Thomas hadn't simply offered shelter to strangers in need, he had potentially endangered himself and his tenuous relationship with his tribe to do so. I didn't know, she said. If I had realized the risk. Would you have chosen differently? Joseph interrupted. Left your child to the mercy of winter and those who hunt you? No, Abigail admitted, but I wouldn't have wanted to bring danger to his door. Joseph's expression softened. Thomas knows the cost of his choices, he said. He has always known. They walked on, each lost in their own thoughts. The ridge path gradually descended, leading them into a small, sheltered valley north of Thomas's main cabin. Here the trees grew thicker, providing better cover from both the elements and any watching eyes. Just as Abigail's strength was beginning to fail, Joseph stopped and pointed ahead. There, he said. Nestled among a stand of pines stood a small cabin, more modest than Thomas's main dwelling, but sturdy and well-built. Unlike the larger cabin, this one was constructed in a traditional Apache style with a sunken floor and a low profile that blended naturally into the landscape. He built this first, Joseph explained as they approached, before the white man's cabin, when he still honored the old ways. The interior of the cabin was simple, a central fire pit surrounded by woven mat shelves built into the walls, holding basic provisions and a single window positioned to catch the morning sun. Though it had clearly been unoccupied for some time, the space was clean and dry, protected from the elements by Thomas's careful construction. Joseph set Charlotte down on one of the mats and busied himself building a fire in the central pit. Abigail sank gratefully onto another mat, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Charlotte, now fully awake, explored the new space with cautious curiosity. Will Thomas be able to find us here? Abigail asked, unable to keep the worry from her voice. Joseph nodded as he coaxed the kindling into flame. He knows these mountains better than anyone. If he is able, he will come. The qualifier hung in the air between them, unacknowledged but impossible to ignore. If he is able, if he survived whatever confrontation had occurred at the cabin. If that rifle shot hadn't. Abigail pushed the thought away, focusing instead on practical matters. She helped Joseph prepare a simple meal from the provisions stored in the cabin, dried meat, pine nuts, and herbs steeped into a tea that warmed them from within. As the afternoon waned into evening, Charlotte grew restless, unused to being confined in such a small space. To distract her, Joseph began telling traditional Apache stories, his deep voice rising and falling in the patterns of a born storyteller. Though many of the words were in Apache, his expressive gestures and occasional English translations kept Charlotte enthralled. Abigail listened too, finding comfort in the ancient tales of coyotes' tricks and eagles' wisdom. There was something timeless about sitting in a circle around firelight, sharing stories as humans had done since the beginning of language. For a few precious moments, the danger pursuing them seemed distant and abstract. Night fell, bringing with it a deeper cold that pressed against the cabin walls like a living thing. Joseph maintained the fire, occasionally stepping outside to check for any sign of Thomas or their pursuers. Each time he returned alone, the weight of worry settled more heavily on Abigail's heart. When Charlotte finally succumbed to sleep, curled beneath a thick fur blanket Joseph had found stored in the cabin, Abigail approached the old man as he sat by the fire carving a small piece of wood with practiced strokes. "You should tell me everything," she said quietly, settling beside him. "About Thomas, about Fort Laramie, about why Victor Holloway would be tracking us with lawmen." Joseph's hand stilled the half-formed carving, a small horse Abigail thought resting in his palm. "Some stories are not mine to tell," he replied. "Thomas isn't here to tell them." Abigail pointed out, a tremor in her voice betraying her fear. "And I need to understand what we're facing." Joseph studied her for a long moment, the firelight deepening the lines in his face. What he saw must have satisfied him, for he nodded once and set aside his carving. Thomas Running Wolf and Victor Holloway were both scouts for the Army at Fort Laramie. He began, his voice low to avoid waking Charlotte. Both mixed blood, both skilled trackers. But they saw their role differently. Victor believed in proving his worth to the white world by being more ruthless than any white scout. Thomas. He paused, selecting his words carefully. Thomas tried to walk a middle path to prevent bloodshed where possible. "What happened?" Abigail prompted when Joseph fell silent. The old man's eyes reflected the dancing flames. "There was a band of Lakota women children, a few old men who had left the reservation searching for food. Starvation was common that winter. The Indian agent was stealing the rations meant for our people." His voice took on a harder edge. "A common story, as you now know." Abigail nodded, thinking of Edmund's discoveries about the misappropriated tribal funds in Dalton. "The commander at Fort Laramie ordered Thomas and Victor to track this band," Joseph continued. "His intention was to make an example of them to discourage others from leaving the reservations. Thomas refused. More than refused, he warned the Lakota help them escape across the river before the soldiers could find them. And Victor reported Thomas's actions to the commander. Thomas was arrested, facing execution for treason." Joseph's expression darkened with memory. "But he escaped before they could hang him. Some say Victor helped him escape only to betray him later for the bounty. Others say Thomas fought his way free alone." "And his wife and son?" Abigail asked, though she dreaded the answer. "They were staying with our band while Thomas was at the fort," Joseph said. "After his escape, soldiers came looking for him. When they couldn't find him, He shook his head, unable or unwilling to speak the details aloud. "They called it a skirmish. We called it murder." Abigail's hand went to her mouth, horror and grief washing over her. "And Thomas believes Victor was responsible." "Victor led the soldiers to our camp," Joseph confirmed. "Whether he intended what followed," he shrugged, "only he knows the truth of his heart." "How terrible," Abigail whispered, imagining Thomas's pain at losing his family while he himself was in hiding, unable even to bury them or properly mourn. "After that, Thomas disappeared for nearly a year," Joseph said. "When he returned, he built a cabin in the hidden valley and withdrew from both worlds. He carved wood, hunted, lived alone, spoke to few, trusted fewer. Until we literally stumbled into his life," Abigail said, understanding now the magnitude of what it had cost Thomas to open his door to them. Joseph nodded. "Which brings us to your question about why Victor Holloway would be tracking you with lawmen." He leaned closer, his voice dropping even lower. "I believe it is not coincidence. Your husband's discovery about tribal funds and Dalton Thomas's experience at Fort Laramie, they are connected by the same thread." "How could they be connected?" Abigail asked, bewildered. "Think Mrs. Reed," Joseph urged. "Who benefits most from stealing from the tribes, from breaking treaties, from taking land that should be protected?" Abigail considered this, her mind working through the implications. "Investors," she said slowly. "People funding the railroads, the mining operations, the cattle ranches. They need the land that was promised to the tribes by treaty. And such men have long arms," Joseph said grimly. "They reach into territorial governments, town councils, even the army. You think the same people behind the embezzlement in Dalton were connected to what happened at Fort Laramie? Abigail asked, the pieces falling into place with terrible clarity. I think powerful men protect their interests, Joseph replied, and eliminate threats to those interests. Your husband became such a threat. As did Thomas, Abigail murmured. Joseph nodded solemnly. Now perhaps you understand the complicated path. Before Abigail could respond, a sound from outside the cabin froze them both, the soft crunch of snow beneath a careful footfall. Joseph moved with surprising speed for his age, dousing the fire with a handful of sand kept ready for this purpose. In the sudden darkness, he pressed a knife into Abigail's hand and motioned for her to move to Charlotte's side. Heart pounding, Abigail crouched protectively over her sleeping daughter, the unfamiliar weight of the knife awkward in her grip. Joseph moved silently to the window, peering out into the moonlit night. Long moments passed, measured only by the thunder of Abigail's pulse in her ears. Then, almost imperceptibly, Joseph relaxed. Thomas, he breathed a single word, filling Abigail with such relief that she nearly dropped the knife. The door opened, admitting a blast of cold air and the tall figure of Thomas Running Wolf. Snow dusted his shoulders and hair, and his face was drawn with exhaustion, but he was blessedly, miraculously alive. You're hurt, Abigail gasped, noticing for the first time the dark stain on his left sleeve. Thomas shook his head dismissively. A graze only, he said, his voice rough with fatigue. The bullet found cloth more than flesh. Joseph rekindled the fire while Abigail helped Thomas remove his coat. The wound was indeed minor, a bloody furrow across his upper arm that had already begun to close. Still, it needed cleaning. As Abigail washed the injury with water warmed by the rekindled fire, she finally asked the question that had been haunting her since they fled the cabin. What happened? Who were they? Thomas winced slightly as she dabbed at the wound, but his voice remained steady. Marshal Davies from the Territorial Office, a man named Parker who claimed to be a lawyer from Dalton, and Victor Holloway. What did they want? Joseph asked, handing Thomas a cup of hot tea. Officially, they are searching for Mrs. Reed as a material witness in an investigation into her husband's death, Thomas replied. Unofficially, he met Abigail's eyes. They believe you have documents that could implicate certain powerful men in crimes against the tribes. Edmund's evidence, Abigail said. But I told you I don't have it. I found some notes after his death, but nothing conclusive. Thomas sipped his tea, considering. They seem very certain. Did they say who sent them? Joseph asked. No, Thomas replied. But Parker mentioned investors concerned about disruption to regional development. Joseph's expression darkened. The same words always, he muttered. Different mouths, same masters. How did you get away? Abigail asked, finishing with the bandage on Thomas's arm. A ghost of a smile touched Thomas's lips. They did not expect me to know the cabin as well as I do, he said, or to have preparations for unwelcome visitors. Abigail could imagine it, Thomas cornered, but calm, using his intimate knowledge of the cabin's layout to create an opportunity for escape. The image both impressed and troubled her. And the shot we heard, she pressed. Marshal Davies. Thomas said, his expression hardening. A warning shot, he claimed, though it came closer than a warning should. Will they follow us here? Abigail couldn't keep the fear from her voice as she glanced at Charlotte, still sleeping peacefully despite the earlier commotion. Thomas exchanged a look with Joseph before answering. Not immediately, he said. I left them with difficulties. The careful phrasing told Abigail he had done something to delay pursuit, disabled their horses perhaps, or created some other obstacle that would buy them time without causing serious harm to the lawmen. She decided not to press for details. How long will we be safe here? She asked instead. A few days perhaps, Thomas replied, but we cannot stay indefinitely. Victor knows these mountains too well. And Marshal Davies has the authority to summon more men, Joseph added, even soldiers if he claims there is resistance to the law. The prospect of armed soldiers combing the mountains for them sent a chill through Abigail that had nothing to do with the winter night. Then where can we go? She asked, one hand moving protectively to her belly. I can't keep running forever. Not like this. Thomas's eyes followed the movement of her hand, a shadow of concern crossing his face. How much time remains before the child comes? 2 months, perhaps less, Abigail admitted. Though with all this, she gestured vaguely, encompassing their flight, the stress, the constant fear. It could be sooner. Thomas nodded, his expression grave. Then we must find a more permanent solution before then. He turned to Joseph. The Shoshone camp at Wind's Rim, would they shelter her? Joseph shook his head. Not now. The Indian agent there is in the pocket of the same men who seek her. And with her condition, he glanced at Abigail's pregnant form. She would be noticed, remembered. Thomas rose, moving to the cabin's small window to gaze out at the moonlit forest. His profile outlined against the night looked carved from the same stone as the surrounding mountains, weathered, resolute, enduring. Then we must find another way, he said finally. One that does not involve endless flight. You have an idea, Joseph observed, reading something in Thomas's posture that Abigail couldn't discern. Thomas turned back to them, his decision apparently made. Yes, he said simply, but it will require trust. Trust from whom? Abigail asked. From all of us, Thomas replied, but especially from you, Mrs. Reed. Abigail, she corrected automatically. After everything that's happened, I think formality is rather beside the point. A fleeting smile touched Thomas's lips. Abigail, then. He returned to the fire, sitting cross-legged on the mat opposite her. I believe there is a reason they are so certain you have evidence that could harm them. What reason? Your husband was a careful man, yes, methodical in his work. Abigail nodded. Edmund documented everything. It was a point of pride for him. And when he discovered the embezzlement, he would have gathered proof, Thomas continued. Copies of ledgers, records of transactions, names of those involved. Yes, but as I told you, I never found those documents, Abigail said, frustration edging her voice. I searched our house thoroughly after his death. Perhaps because he didn't keep them in your house, Thomas suggested. A man uncovering crimes by powerful men would know the danger. He would hide such evidence somewhere safer. Abigail frowned, considering this. But where and why wouldn't he tell me? To protect you, Joseph interjected. If you didn't know where the evidence was hidden, you couldn't be forced to reveal it. The logic was sound, but it left Abigail no closer to understanding where Edmund might have concealed his proof. Even if that's true, she said, how would we find it now? And how would it help our current situation? If we could locate your husband's evidence, Thomas explained, we would have leverage, something to negotiate with. Negotiate, Abigail echoed, disbelieving. With the same men who had Edmund killed, who tried to destroy his reputation, who are hunting me and my daughter. Yes, Thomas said simply, because men like that value only two things, money and reputation. Your husband's evidence threatens both. You want to blackmail them, Abigail said, the word tasting sour on her tongue. I want to survive, Thomas corrected, and ensure that you and your children survive as well. Joseph nodded slowly, his weathered face thoughtful in the firelight. It could work, he admitted. Such men fear exposure more than they fear God. Abigail shook her head, not in disagreement, but in bewilderment at the direction their conversation had taken. But we still don't know where Edmund might have hidden his evidence. It could be anywhere. Not anywhere, Thomas said. Somewhere he believed was safe yet accessible. Somewhere he trusted. He leaned forward, his dark eyes intent on Abigail's face. Think, Abigail. Who did your husband trust? Who would he turn to with something this important? Abigail closed her eyes, trying to recall Edmund's closest associates in Dalton. Samuel Morgan, she said finally. They worked together at the town hall. Samuel was the only one who shared Edmund's concerns about the discrepancies in the ledgers. Would he have entrusted the evidence to this Samuel? Thomas asked. Possibly, Abigail admitted, but Samuel was in Cheyenne when Edmund died. He returned for the funeral but left again immediately after. A memory surfaced, sharp and sudden. He tried to speak with me privately at the wake, but the mayor's wife kept intervening. I thought at the time she was being solicitous, but perhaps she was ensuring no information was passed to you, Joseph finished. Is there anyone else your husband might have trusted with such important documents? Thomas pressed. Abigail thought, carefully mentally reviewing the people in their lives in Dalton. Pastor Michaels, perhaps. Edmund respected him greatly. Or Dr. Collins, he delivered Charlotte and was a family friend. Thomas nodded, absorbing this information. And what of places? Was there somewhere special to him? Somewhere he felt secure? An image came to Abigail's mind. Edmund seated at his desk in their home, a small wooden box open before him. He had a box, she said slowly, walnut with brass fittings. He kept important papers in it, our marriage certificate, Charlotte's birth record, the deed to our house. Did you find this box after his death? Thomas asked. Abigail shook her head. No, I assumed it was at his office in the town hall. But when I went to collect his personal effects, Mayor Hollister said everything had already been packed and sent to our house. Her brow furrowed. Except it never arrived. Thomas and Joseph exchanged a significant look. The box itself may have contained evidence, Joseph suggested, or at least a clue to where the evidence was hidden. Thomas agreed. Abigail's heart raced with the implications. If that's true, then Mayor Hollister or someone working with him must have taken it, which means they still don't have the actual evidence, Thomas pointed out. Only perhaps a hint to its location. If they had found it already, they wouldn't still be searching for you. Hope, fragile but persistent, flickered to life in Abigail's chest. So if we could find Edmund's evidence before they do, we would have what they fear most, Thomas confirmed. The truth. The conversation continued deep into the night, the three adults speaking in low voices to avoid waking Charlotte. They considered and discarded various possibilities for where Edmund might have hidden his documentation, always returning to the same challenge without knowing exactly what they were looking for, or where it might be. How could they hope to find it before their pursuers did? We need more information, Thomas finally concluded, about what happened in Dalton after you fled, about who else might have been involved in the embezzlement. Victor might know, Joseph suggested. He works for whoever pays him, but he hears things others do not. Thomas's expression darkened at the mention of his former companion. Victor is not likely to share information with me, he said dryly. No, Joseph agreed, but he might speak to me. He still respects the old ways, the Council of Elders. It's too dangerous, Thomas objected. If he realizes you're helping us— Victor and I have history of our own, Joseph interrupted. Before he chose his path, he will hear me out at least. Thomas looked as though he wanted to argue further, but something in Joseph's expression made him reconsider. How would you even find him? He asked instead. He will make camp near your cabin, Joseph replied. The valley offers the best shelter in these mountains, and Victor was never one to sleep rough when comfort was available. And while you speak with Victor, what of us? Abigail asked, gesturing to herself and Charlotte. You remain here, Thomas said. The hunting cabin is well hidden, and few know of its existence. Joseph will return to the main cabin as if he's been out gathering herbs. He will claim ignorance of your whereabouts if asked. And you, Abigail pressed. Thomas's expression was unreadable. I will be elsewhere, he said simply, creating a false trail for them to follow. You're going to lead them away from us, Abigail realized. Deliberately put yourself at risk. Thomas shrugged the gesture dismissive. I know these mountains better than Victor, better than any territorial marshal. They will not catch me. Unless that's exactly what Victor expects you to do, Abigail pointed out. He knows you, Thomas, worked with you. What if he anticipates this strategy? A flash of something respect perhaps lit Thomas's eyes. Then I will need to be unpredictable, he said. The plan, though fraught with risks, was the best they could devise under the circumstances. They would rest for the remainder of the night, then separate in the morning Joseph to return to the main cabin and gather intelligence from Victor Thomas to create a diversion that would draw their pursuers away from the hunting cabin and Abigail to remain hidden with Charlotte until one or both men returned. As they prepared for sleep, arranging the limited bedding to make the most of the cabin's warmth, Abigail found herself studying Thomas covertly. In the dim firelight, the planes of his face seemed carved from shadow and stone, revealing little of the thoughts behind his stoic expression. Yet she had come to recognize the subtle signs of his emotions, the slight tightening around his eyes when he was concerned, the almost imperceptible softening of his mouth when Charlotte did something that amused him. This man who had lost so much, who had chosen solitude as a shield against further pain, was now risking everything to protect her and her children. The realization humbled and troubled her in equal measure. Thomas, she said softly as Joseph settled into sleep across the fire pit, you don't have to do this. You've already done more than I had any right to expect. Thomas looked up from checking his rifle, his expression difficult to read in the flickering light. I made a choice when I brought you to my cabin, he said simply. I will see it through. But why? Abigail pressed. You don't know me, don't owe me anything. You've already lost so much because of men like those hunting us. Thomas was silent for a long moment, his hand still on the rifle. When my wife and son were killed, he finally said, his voice so low Abigail had to lean forward to hear him, I was not there to protect them. I was miles away hunting elk, unaware of the danger approaching our camp. Abigail's heart ached at the raw pain evident in his quiet words. That wasn't your fault, she said gently. Perhaps not, Thomas acknowledged. But it is my reality. I was not there when they needed me most. He set the rifle aside and met her gaze directly. I am here now. That is a choice I can make. The simple declaration, delivered without drama or self-pity, moved Abigail deeply. Thank you. She whispered, the words wholly inadequate for what she felt. Thomas nodded once, accepting her gratitude without needing further elaboration. Sleep now, he said. Tomorrow will come early. Abigail settled onto her bedding, drawing Charlotte's sleeping form close against the chill of the night. Despite her exhaustion, sleep proved elusive, her mind racing with all she had learned about Thomas, about the connections between Edmund's death and events at Fort Laramie, about the powerful forces arrayed against them. When she finally drifted into uneasy slumber, her dreams were a confused tangle of images: Edmund hanging from the oak tree, his feet oddly close to the ground; Thomas standing alone against three shadowy figures; Victor Holloway with a face that kept shifting between human features and the predatory mask of a wolf. She woke with a start to find pale dawn light filtering through the cabin's single window. Thomas was already up, checking his rifle and knife with methodical precision. Joseph crouched by the fire pit, coaxing the banked embers back to life for a final meal before they separated. Did you sleep? Abigail asked Thomas, noting the shadows beneath his eyes. Enough, he replied, not looking up from his weapons. They ate a spare breakfast in near silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts about the day ahead. Charlotte, picking up on the tension in the adults, was unusually subdued, clinging to Abigail's side and casting frequent glances at Thomas, as if sensing he was preparing to leave. When it was time for them to part, Thomas knelt before Charlotte, bringing himself to her eye level. From his pocket, he withdrew a small wooden carving, a horse Abigail realized, recognizing it as the piece Joseph had been working on the previous evening. For you, Thomas said, placing it in Charlotte's small palm, to keep watch until I return. Charlotte accepted the carving with solemn reverence, then surprised all of them by throwing her arms around Thomas's neck in a fierce hug. Be careful, she said, echoing words she had clearly heard Abigail say. For a moment, Thomas seemed frozen by the child's embrace. Then slowly his arms came up to return it, his large hand gently cradling the back of Charlotte's head. Over the child's shoulder, his eyes met Abigail's, something raw and unguarded in their depths. I will, he promised Charlotte, his voice rougher than usual. You take care of your mother. When he straightened, the vulnerability was gone, replaced by the focused determination that seemed to be his natural state. He spoke briefly with Joseph, confirming the details of their plan in rapid Apache that Abigail couldn't follow. Then, with a final nod to Abigail, he was gone, slipping out of the cabin and into the early morning light, like a shadow retreating before the sun. Joseph prepared to leave shortly after, gathering a small pack of herbs and medicines to support his story of having been out collecting. Before departing, he approached Abigail, his weathered hands enfolding hers in a gesture that felt both blessing and promise. Trust Thomas, he said simply. Whatever happens, whatever you may hear, he will not abandon you. With that cryptic admonition, Joseph too departed, leaving Abigail and Charlotte alone in the small hunting cabin. The silence that fell in the wake of the men's departure seemed to press against Abigail's skin, broken only by Charlotte's soft humming as she played with her wooden horse and rabbit. To keep herself occupied and her mind from spiraling into worry, Abigail took inventory of their supplies, rationing them carefully in case their stay extended beyond the day or two they had planned. She found a small store of dried herbs, similar to those in Thomas's main cabin, and set some to steep for tea. The familiar domestic actions provided a semblance of normalcy in a situation that was anything but normal. As the morning stretched into afternoon, Abigail found herself repeatedly drawn to the cabin's small window, scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of movement. The snow-covered landscape remained peaceful, unmarked by human presence. Charlotte eventually tired of playing and curled up for a nap, the wooden animals clutched protectively in her small hands. Abigail covered her with a fur blanket, then returned to her vigil at the window, her thoughts turning inevitably to Thomas. What kind of man was he, this solitary figure who had welcomed them into his refuge, who had lost everything yet still found the capacity to offer protection to strangers? In the short time they had known each other, Abigail had glimpsed layers to Thomas' running, wolf that belied his stoic exterior, intelligence, dry humor, gentleness with Charlotte, a code of honor that transcended the conflicts between his dual heritage. And beneath it all, a grief so profound it had led him to withdraw from both the worlds he had once bridged, until their arrival had forced him back into engagement with the very forces that had taken his family. The realization of what their presence had cost him was still costing him weighed heavily on Abigail's heart. If Thomas or Joseph were captured because of her, how could she ever forgive herself? The afternoon waned, shadows lengthening across the snow as the sun began its descent behind the western mountains. Abigail prepared a simple meal for herself and Charlotte, rationing their supplies carefully. As darkness fell, she lit the small oil lamp Joseph had left behind, keeping the flame low to avoid it being visible from outside. Charlotte, restless after her long confinement in the cabin, begged for stories. Abigail obliged, recounting fairy tales from her own childhood and simplified versions of the Greek myths her father had taught her. The familiar narratives comforted them both, creating a small bubble of normalcy within their extraordinary circumstances. When Charlotte finally succumbed to sleep once more, Abigail resumed her watch at the window, though darkness had now rendered the surrounding forest a study in black and deeper black. The moon, a thin crescent, provided little illumination, and the stars seemed distant and cold in the vast winter sky. A sound from outside, the snap of a twig beneath a careful foot, jerked Abigail fully alert. She extinguished the lamp, immediately plunging the cabin into darkness, and moved silently to Charlotte's side, one hand finding the knife Joseph had given her the previous night. Seconds stretched into minutes as Abigail strained to hear any further movement outside. Had she imagined it? Or was someone, Thomas or Joseph, returning, or their pursuers having found them approaching the cabin? The soft scrape of the door latch lifting answered her question. Abigail tightened her grip on the knife, positioning herself between the door and Charlotte's sleeping form. The door opened slowly, admitting a gust of frigid air and a figure too large to be Joseph. In the dim starlight filtering through the window, Abigail could make out only a silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered, familiar. "Thomas," she whispered, hope warring with a caution. "It's me," came the reply, his voice unmistakable despite its weariness. Relief coursed through Abigail, so powerful it left her lightheaded. She fumbled to relight the lamp as Thomas secured the door behind him. In the gentle glow of the rekindled flame, Abigail could see that Thomas looked exhausted, his face drawn with fatigue and strain. Snow clung to his coat and hair, and there was a new tear in his sleeve, though no blood visible this time. "What happened?" she asked, keeping her voice low to avoid waking Charlotte. "Is Joseph—" "Joseph is safe," Thomas assured her, removing his snow-covered coat. "He made contact with Victor as planned." And Thomas moved to the fire pit, adding kindling to the banked coals with practiced efficiency. "Victor was surprisingly forthcoming." He said, a note of puzzlement in his voice. "Perhaps because Joseph approached him alone, or perhaps—" He trailed off, shaking his head, as if dismissing a troubling thought. "What did he tell Joseph?" Abigail pressed. Thomas straightened as the kindling caught the small flames, illuminating his face from below and emphasizing the sharp angles of his cheekbones and jaw. "Many things," he said. "Some we suspected, some new." He gestured for Abigail to sit as he settled cross-legged by the growing fire. "The most important is that your husband's evidence does exist, and it is more damaging than even we imagined." Abigail's heart quickened. "How does Victor know this?" "Because he was hired to find it," Thomas replied. "Not by Marshall Davies or the lawyer Parker, but by someone higher, a man named Harrison Blackwood, a banker from Denver with investments in railroads, mining, and territorial development. And connections to the tribal funds embezzlement in Dalton," Abigail guessed. Thomas nodded. "According to Victor, Blackwood is part of a consortium of investors who have been systematically diverting funds meant for tribal support across several territories. The money is used to finance their expansion into lands that should be protected by treaty." "Just as Joseph suspected," Abigail murmured. "Yes, but there's more." Thomas leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. "Your husband didn't just discover the embezzlement in Dalton. He found a pattern across multiple territories, multiple years. Names, dates, amounts, all documented. And he compiled it all into a single dossier." "That would explain why they're so determined to find it," Abigail said. "Such evidence could ruin them." It could do more than ruin them, Thomas replied grimly. It could send them to prison. The federal government may turn a blind eye to many injustices against the tribes, but the theft of federal funds on this scale would be harder to ignore, especially with public exposure. A new thought occurred to Abigail, sending a chill through her that had nothing to do with the winter night outside. If the evidence is that damaging, they'll never stop hunting for it, or for anyone who knows about it. Thomas held her gaze steadily. That is the reality we face, he acknowledged. But Victor provided one more piece of information that may change everything. What? He believes he knows where your husband hid the evidence, Thomas said, or at least where to begin looking for it. Where Abigail's voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might cause this fragile thread of hope to snap. Thomas stared into the fire flames reflecting in his dark eyes. According to Victor, your husband had a friend at the Cheyenne newspaper, a man named Wilson. They attended university together years ago. James Wilson, Abigail confirmed, surprise evident in her voice. Edmund did mention him occasionally, but I never met him. What does he have to do with the evidence? Victor believes Edmund sent the complete dossier to Wilson for safekeeping and potential publication if anything happened to him. Thomas's gaze shifted from the fire to Abigail's face. Wilson has not published it, which suggests he either never received it or is waiting for some kind of signal or verification. Abigail's mind raced with the implications. But if Edmund sent the evidence to Cheyenne, why would they still be hunting me? Surely they would focus their efforts on Wilson. Because of the key, Thomas said simply. What key? Victor says the dossier was encoded names replaced with numbers, dates, obscured locations, given code names. A precaution in case it fell into the wrong hands during transit. The key to decode it would have been sent separately or given to someone Edmund trusted implicitly. Understanding dawned in Abigail's eyes. They think I have the key. Thomas nodded. Or know who does. Without it, the dossier is just a collection of numbers and coded references, suspicious but not damning. Abigail rose and began pacing the small confines of the cabin, her movements agitated but careful not to disturb the sleeping Charlotte. But I don't have any key. Edmund never gave me anything like that, never even hinted at it. Would you recognize it if you saw it? Thomas asked. It might not be obvious, perhaps disguised as something innocent. A poem, a letter, even a list of household accounts. Abigail stopped pacing her hand unconsciously, moving to the small locket she wore around her neck, a gift from Edmund on their 5th wedding anniversary. Inside was a miniature portrait of Charlotte as an infant, opposite a small piece of paper, with what appeared to be a poem in Edmund's neat handwriting. Oh, she breathed, fingers trembling as she unclasped the locket. Could it be this simple? Thomas watched intently as she carefully extracted the folded paper and opened it. The poem was a series of couplets, seemingly romantic but oddly specific in their imagery. He gave me this locket with Charlotte's portrait when she was born. Abigail explained, handing the paper to Thomas. This was on the other side. I always thought it was just a love poem he'd written. It wasn't very good, to be honest, but I treasured it because it came from him. Thomas examined the paper, his expression thoughtful. These aren't random images, he said after a moment. Look at the first word of each line. Abigail leaned closer, reading over his shoulder. First, National, Bank, Cheyenne, Box, 73, Ledger, 3, Page, 19. She looked up, eyes wide. It's a location and a reference within a ledger. A safety deposit box, Thomas confirmed, with a specific page that likely contains the actual decoding key. A mixture of emotions crossed Abigail's face, vindication that Edmund had indeed been as careful and thorough as she'd believed, pain at the reminder of all he'd lost in pursuit of justice, and a dawning hope that perhaps his death might not have been in vain after all. We need to get to Cheyenne, she said firmly. Thomas's expression remained guarded. It's risky. The territorial capital will be heavily watched, especially the banks and newspaper offices. But it's our only chance, Abigail insisted. If we can get the key and find Wilson, we can decode the dossier and expose everything. And if we're caught, everything your husband died for will be lost, Thomas countered, along with any chance of safety for you and your children. Abigail's hand went protectively to her belly, where the unborn child shifted restlessly as if sensing her agitation. I can't keep running forever, Thomas, especially not with a newborn. Thomas was silent for a long moment, weighing options, calculating risks. There may be another way, he said finally. A compromise. What do you suggest? I go to Cheyenne alone, he said. You and Charlotte remain hidden, not here, but somewhere even safer. Where could possibly be safer than this remote cabin? The Arapaho camp at Medicine Bow, Thomas replied. Joseph's sister is a respected elder there. They would shelter you, especially in your condition. Abigail shook her head firmly. No, I won't be separated from the evidence. It's all I have left of Edmund, the only chance to clear his name. This isn't about clearing names anymore, Thomas said, a new edge to his voice. It's about survival. Yours, Charlotte's the child you carry. And yours, Abigail challenged. What about your survival, Thomas? You'd risk everything to go into Cheyenne, a mixed-blood man wanted for desertion, attempting to access a bank box that powerful men are certainly watching. Thomas's jaw tightened. I have lived with risk for years. And I have lived with grief and injustice, Abigail countered. I won't hide in safety while you face danger alone. Not when it's my husband's work, my family's future at stake. They faced each other across the fire, neither willing to yield the air between them, charged with the intensity of their convictions. Finally, Thomas exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. We will discuss this further with Joseph when he returns, he said, not quite conceding, but at least postponing the argument. His counsel may offer a path we haven't considered. Abigail nodded, accepting the temporary truce. When do you expect him? Dawn, if all goes as planned, Thomas replied, glancing toward the window where night still pressed thick and dark against the glass. He was to spend the night at the main cabin, gathering what information he could from Victor, before slipping away. Do you trust Victor? Abigail asked the question that had been troubling her since Thomas first relayed the bounty hunter's information. Thomas's expression turned inward, complex emotions playing across his normally stoic features. Trust no, but I believe this information is genuine. Why would he help us? You said there was bad blood between you. There is, Thomas confirmed, but Victor and I share a history that goes beyond our enmity. We were both caught between worlds, both used by those in power. A shadow crossed his face, and I believe he has carried his own guilt since Fort Laramie. Abigail studied him, seeing the cost of this admission in the tightness around his eyes. You think he regrets his role in what happened to your family? I think Victor serves whoever pays him, Thomas replied carefully. But I also think he did not expect or intend the massacre that followed when he led the soldiers to our camp. That doesn't absolve him, but it may explain why he would provide information now. Or it could be a trap, Abigail suggested softly. Thomas nodded, acknowledging the possibility. Which is why we wait for Joseph before making any decision. They fell into silence, then each lost in their own thoughts as the fire burned low. Thomas eventually rose to add more wood, his movements economical and practiced. When he settled again, Abigail noticed for the first time the deep fatigue etched in his features. You should rest, she said. I can keep watch for a while. Thomas looked as though he might object, but weariness seemed to overtake his habitual vigilance. Wake me in 2 hours, he agreed, finally stretching out on one of the sleeping mats near the fire. Abigail watched as his breathing gradually deepened and slowed, the rare vulnerability of sleep softening the hard lines of his face. In repose, the grief he carried was more evident, visible in the furrow that remained between his brows, even in slumber, in the downward turn of his mouth. She found herself wondering what Thomas had been like before loss carved its indelible marks into him, before he chose solitude as both sanctuary and penance. The glimpses she'd seen of the man beneath the stoic exterior, his gentleness with Charlotte, his quiet humor, his unwavering sense of justice, suggested someone who had once engaged fully with life before retreat became necessary for survival. The night passed slowly, marked by the gradual shift of shadows as the fire ebbed and flowed with Abigail's occasional feeding. She did not wake Thomas after 2 hours, allowing him the uninterrupted rest he so clearly needed. Instead, she kept her vigil by the window, watching as the velvet darkness gradually yielded to the pearl-gray light of approaching dawn. Charlotte stirred first, waking with the innocent immediacy of childhood, one moment asleep, the next fully alert. Mama, she whispered loudly, her eyes widening as she spotted Thomas asleep by the fire. He came back. Shh, Abigail cautioned, though Thomas was already awakening, his hunter's instincts responsive even in sleep. Yes, he came back just as he promised. Thomas sat up instantly, alert, despite having slept in his clothes on the hard floor. His eyes went first to the window, assessing the light, then to the door, checking for signs of disturbance. "You were to wake me," he said to Abigail, a note of disapproval in his voice. "You needed the rest more than I needed sleep," she replied simply. Before Thomas could respond, Charlotte toddled over to him, the wooden horse clutched in her small hand. "It worked," she announced with the absolute certainty of a child. Horse kept watch. Something in Thomas's expression softened as he regarded the little girl. "So it did," he agreed gravely, accepting the carving she thrust toward him for inspection. "A good guardian." Charlotte beamed at this confirmation of her magical thinking, then turned her attention to more immediate concerns. "Hungry, Mama." The domestic routine of preparing breakfast provided a brief illusion of normalcy, Abigail warming the last of their dried fruit with a small portion of oats, Thomas checking his weapons in the perimeter of the cabin, Charlotte chattering about the adventures of her wooden animals during the night. The illusion shattered with a sharp knock at the door. Thomas moved instantly, positioning himself between the door and Abigail with Charlotte. His rifle was in his hands, though not yet raised. "Who comes?" he called, his voice controlled but alert. "It is Joseph," came the reply, the familiar voice bringing immediate relief. "With news that cannot wait." Thomas lowered the rifle and opened the door, admitting Joseph along with a blast of cold morning air. The old man looked weary but unharmed, his eyes grave as he took in the three of them. "Victor is dead," he announced without preamble. Thomas stiffened, his hand tightening on the rifle. "How?" "Shot in his bedroll at the cabin," Joseph replied, moving to the fire to warm his hands. "The marshal and the lawyer believe he was meeting with you, planning to betray them. They left his body as a message." Abigail gasped, instinctively pulling Charlotte closer. "When did this happen?" "Before dawn," Joseph said. "I was gathering herbs on the ridge when I heard the shot. I saw them ride out soon after heading east toward Cheyenne." Thomas's expression had turned to granite. "He told them," he said flatly, "about the bank box, about Wilson." Joseph nodded grimly. "I believe so. They spoke of tying up loose ends before they left." "Wilson is in danger," Abigail realized, "and anyone else who might know about Edmund's evidence." "We must move quickly," Thomas said, already gathering his few belongings, "if they reach Cheyenne before us." "Wait," Joseph interrupted, raising a hand. "There is more you should know." He glanced meaningfully at Charlotte, who was watching the adults with one of those solemn eyes. Understanding the need for privacy, Abigail knelt beside her daughter. "Charlotte, sweetheart, why don't you pack up your wooden animals? We'll be going on another adventure soon." When Charlotte was occupied with her task on the far side of the cabin, Joseph continued in a lower voice. "Victor spoke to me last night after you left Thomas. He knew he was in danger, had known from the moment he accepted this assignment." "What did he tell you?" Thomas asked, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "Many things," Joseph replied. "Some meant for you alone." He withdrew a folded paper from inside his coat. "He wrote this, said it would explain what words could not." Thomas accepted the paper, but did not open it, instead tucking it inside his own coat. Whatever reckoning existed between him and Victor, it would be private. "Did he mention anything else about the evidence?" Abigail asked. "We found what we believe is the key, a coded message in a locket Edmund gave me." Joseph nodded. Victor suspected something similar, but he also warned that Blackwood and his associates would have contingencies in place at the bank and the newspaper office. They will be expecting someone to try to access the box. "So Cheyenne is definitely a trap," Thomas said, his suspicion confirmed. "Yes," Joseph agreed, "but perhaps not an inescapable one." "What do you mean?" Abigail asked. Joseph's weathered face took on a sly expression reminiscent of the trickster figure in the stories he had told Charlotte. Victor suggested an approach they would not expect. Something so obvious it becomes invisible. "Speak plainly, old man," Thomas said, though there was no real impatience in his tone. Joseph smiled faintly. "The territorial governor is hosting a reception tomorrow night. A fundraiser for Indian education, one of those events where white men ease their consciences with champagne and donations." "What does that have to do with us?" Abigail asked, bewildered. "Blackwood will be there," Joseph explained, "as will most of the powerful men in the territory, including those watching the bank and newspaper office." Understanding dawned on Thomas's face. While they're all gathered in one place, The bank and Wilson become more accessible, Joseph finished. Still dangerous, but less watched. It could work, Thomas acknowledged, but it would require precise timing and he glanced at Abigail, his concern evident. It would still mean going into Cheyenne directly into the heart of their power. I told you before I won't be left behind, Abigail said firmly. Not when we're this close. And I told you the risk is too great, Thomas countered, especially in your condition. Joseph watched this exchange with the patient air of one who has seen many such disagreements. Perhaps, he suggested mildly, neither of you needs to go to the bank. Both turned to look at him startled. What do you mean? Abigail asked. I mean, Joseph said that an old Apache man draws little attention in Cheyenne. People see my gray hair and weathered face and assume I am harmless. Invisible. No, Thomas said immediately. It's too dangerous even for you. Joseph's expression turned stern. I am not asking permission, nephew. I am telling you what will be done. The bank won't give you access to Edmund's safety deposit box, Abigail pointed out gently. You would need proof of identity papers. Which is why you will write a letter, Joseph replied, authorizing me as your representative. With your husband's death and your delicate condition, it would not be unusual for you to send someone in your place. Even with a letter they may refuse, Thomas argued. Safety deposit boxes are heavily restricted. Perhaps, Joseph conceded, but it is worth the attempt, and far less dangerous than either of you appearing in Cheyenne. A tense silence fell as Thomas and Abigail considered this proposal. It was Abigail who finally spoke. It could work, she said slowly, especially if we provide some official-looking documentation. Edmund had a seal with the town clerk's insignia. I brought it with me when we fled. She reached into her small pack, withdrawing a worn leather case that contained a brass seal. With the right paper and wording, Thomas still looked unconvinced. And what of Wilson, the newspaper man? Even if Joseph retrieves the key from the bank, we still need the dossier itself. One step at a time, Joseph counseled. If I succeed at the bank, finding Wilson becomes the next task. And if you fail, Thomas pressed. If you're caught, Joseph's smile was serene. Then I am just a confused old Indian who wandered into the wrong building. They may rough me up, but they won't kill me in broad daylight in the territorial capital. Not with the governor hosting a reception for Indian education the same day. Despite the gravity of their situation, Abigail found herself suppressing a smile at the old man's cunning. She could see from Thomas's expression that he was similarly caught between admiration and exasperation. It's still too risky, Thomas maintained, though with less conviction. All paths now carry risk, Joseph said simply. But this one distributes it more evenly among us, rather than placing it all on your shoulders, nephew. The truth of this statement hung in the air between them. Finally, Thomas exhaled slowly, a gesture of grudging acceptance. If we do this, we need a comprehensive plan. Contingencies for every possibility. And we need to move quickly, Abigail added. If they've already left for Cheyenne, they have a head start. They're traveling with a body, Joseph pointed out grimly. That will slow them, force them to stick to less traveled routes. Then we have a chance, Thomas said, his decision apparently made, but not from here. We need to leave immediately. The next few hours passed in a flurry of activity. They gathered what supplies remained, packed their few belongings, and erased all signs of their presence from the hunting cabin. Thomas insisted on setting several false trails radiating outward from the valley, a precaution in case their pursuers returned. By midday, they were moving steadily southeast, following game trails and stream beds that kept them concealed while allowing for reasonably swift progress. Thomas carried Charlotte for much of the journey, the little girl riding on his shoulders with a mixture of excitement and trepidation about this new adventure. Abigail struggled at times with the pace, her advanced pregnancy making the rough terrain challenging, but she pushed forward with grim determination. Edmund's evidence was within reach. At last, she would not falter now, regardless of her physical discomfort. They made camp that night in a dense stand of pine, the trees providing both shelter from the wind and concealment from any watching eyes. As they huddled around a small, carefully screened fire, Thomas unfolded a rough map drawn on a piece of bark and outlined their plan for the days ahead. Medicine Bow is a day's journey from here, he explained, tracing the route with his finger. Joseph's sister's family will shelter you and Charlotte while Joseph and I continue to Cheyenne. Abigail opened her mouth to protest, but Thomas raised a hand to forestall her objection. "Hear me out," he said. "This isn't about excluding you. It's about maximizing our chances of success." "Thomas is right," Joseph added. "The Arapaho camp is perhaps the only truly safe place for you now. Blackwood and his associates would never search for you. There, they don't believe white women would seek refuge with the tribe." "And what about the key?" Abigail asked, touching the locket at her throat. "You'll need it to access the safety deposit box." "Copy the message," Thomas suggested. "Keep the original with you. That way, if something goes wrong, they don't obtain both you and the key." The logic was sound, but Abigail still felt a deep reluctance to be separated from the mission. "And after you get the key and find Wilson." "What then?" "Then we bring the decoded evidence to you," Thomas said, "and together we decide the next step." "Which will be what?" Abigail pressed. "Publishing it, taking it to federal authorities." "What exactly is our end goal here?" Thomas and Joseph exchanged a glance laden with unspoken communication. It was Joseph who finally answered. "Justice in whatever form it can be achieved," he said, "for your husband, for Thomas's family, for all the tribes who have suffered from these men's greed." "Justice doesn't always come through official channels," Thomas added, his voice hardening. "Sometimes it requires more direct approaches." Abigail studied his face in the flickering firelight, seeing the barely contained anger beneath his controlled exterior. "You're talking about vengeance," she said softly. Thomas met her gaze steadily. "I'm talking about accountability. If the law won't hold these men responsible, perhaps fear will." "Blackmail, then." Abigail said, the words still bitter on her tongue. "Protection," Thomas corrected. "Leverage to ensure they never harm anyone else, including you and your children." Abigail fell silent, turning this perspective over in her mind. She had always believed in the rule of law, in the systems of justice that civilized society was built upon. But those same systems had failed. Edmund had allowed powerful men to literally get away with murder. Perhaps Thomas's more pragmatic approach had merit. "I'll consider it," she said finally, "but I reserve judgment until we actually have the evidence in hand." Thomas nodded, accepting her position. "Fair enough." That night, after Charlotte had fallen asleep and Joseph had taken the first watch, Abigail found herself unable to rest despite her exhaustion. She sat up, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the cold, and noticed Thomas seated a short distance away, staring into the dying embers of their fire. "You should sleep," she said quietly, moving to join him. He glanced up, unsurprised by her presence despite her attempt at stealth. "As should you." "My mind won't quiet," she admitted, settling beside him on the fallen log that served as their bench. "Too many possibilities, too many fears." Thomas nodded in understanding. The hours before action are often hardest. They sat in companionable silence for a time, the night sounds of the forest creating a gentle backdrop to their shared vigil. Abigail found herself studying Thomas's profile, strong and resolute against the darkness. "What will you do?" she asked finally. "After this is over, I mean. Will you return to your cabin in the valley?" Thomas considered this, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know," he admitted. "That life, the solitude, the silence, it served its purpose for a time. But now," he trailed off, seeming to search for words. "Now it seems empty," Abigail suggested gently. He met her gaze, something vulnerable flickering briefly in his dark eyes. "Yes," he said simply, "empty." The admission hung between them, weighted with implications neither was ready to fully acknowledge. Abigail felt a curious tightening in her chest, a mixture of hope and trepidation about what might lie beyond their current crisis. "And you, Sam?" Thomas asked after a moment. "If we succeed in clearing your husband's name, securing your safety, what then?" Abigail sighed, her hand moving automatically to her swollen belly, where the child within shifted restlessly. "I've been so focused on survival, on justice for Edmund, I haven't really thought beyond that," she confessed. "I can't return to Dalton, too many painful memories. But where does a widow with 2 small children owe to build a new life?" "Wherever you choose," Thomas said. "You are stronger than you know, Abigail Reed." The simple statement, delivered with such quiet certainty, brought unexpected tears to Abigail's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for that, for everything." Thomas nodded once, accepting her gratitude without need for elaboration. Then, in a gesture that surprised them both, he reached over and briefly covered her hand with his own, a fleeting contact that conveyed more than words could have. The moment passed, but something had shifted between them, a recognition, perhaps, that whatever lay ahead, they would face it not as strangers thrown together by circumstance, but as something closer to true allies. Perhaps even friends. The journey to Medicine Bow the next day was arduous but uneventful. They traveled mainly through forested areas, avoiding open spaces where they might be spotted. Charlotte, sensing the tension in the adults, remained unusually subdued, riding on Thomas's shoulders without her typical stream of questions and observations. By late afternoon, they had reached the outskirts of the Arapaho encampment, situated in a sheltered valley near the Medicine Bow River. Thomas halted their group in a stand of trees overlooking the collection of teepees and more permanent wooden structures that formed the winter camp. "Joseph will go first," he explained to Abigail, "to speak with his sister and prepare them for your arrival." Joseph nodded, handing his small pack to Thomas. "Wait for my signal," he said, then made his way down the slope toward the encampment. They watched as the old man was greeted by several members of the tribe, including a woman whose bearing and the respect shown to her marked her as someone of importance. Joseph's sister Abigail presumed. After a brief conversation, Joseph turned and made a sweeping gesture with his arm, the signal they had agreed upon. "It's safe," Thomas said, hoisting Charlotte higher on his shoulders. "Remember, let me do the talking at first. Many here understand English, but prefer not to use it with outsiders." Abigail nodded, straightening her clothing as best she could and running a hand through her tangled hair. She was acutely aware of how she must appear, a bedraggled white woman, heavily pregnant, arriving at a native encampment with a mixed-blood man and a toddler. Not the usual visitor to an Arapaho winter camp. As they descended into the valley, Abigail felt the weight of curious stares from the camp's inhabitants. Children paused in their play to watch their approach. Women looked up from their work. Men stepped out from teepees to observe the newcomers. Joseph and his sister awaited them at the edge of the encampment. The woman Grey Willow Joseph introduced her was tall and straight-backed, despite her advanced years, with the same keen intelligence in her eyes that characterized her brother. "Welcome," she said to Abigail in careful English. "Joseph tells me you need sanctuary for you and your children." Her gaze moved meaningfully to Abigail's pregnant belly. "Yes," Abigail confirmed. "We're very grateful for your hospitality." Grey Willow studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, to Abigail's surprise, she smiled, a warm, genuine expression that transformed her stern features. "Any friend of Thomas Running Wolf is welcome here," she said. "He has been a friend to our people when few others would stand with us." Relief washed over Abigail at this acceptance. She had feared resistance, resentment of her presence as an outsider, especially given the fraught history between white settlers and the tribes. Instead, she found herself welcomed with a simple dignity that humbled her. Grey Willow led them to a small cabin at the edge of the encampment, one of the few permanent structures, she explained, built for visitors or tribal members who preferred the white man's style of dwelling. It was sparsely furnished, but clean and warm, with a stone fireplace and enough space for Abigail and Charlotte to rest comfortably. "You will stay here," Grey Willow told Abigail. "My granddaughter Singing Bird will bring you food and anything else you need." As if summoned by her name, a young woman appeared in the doorway, her arms laden with blankets and a covered basket that emitted enticing aromas. She nodded shyly to Abigail before setting down her burdens and retreating without a word. "The men will leave at first light," Grey Willow continued. "Until their return, you and your daughter will be under my protection." There was steel beneath the simple statement, a promise that carried the weight of tribal authority. "Thank you," Abigail said, meaning it deeply. "I don't know how to repay such kindness." Grey Willow's expression softened. "There is no debt between those who stand against common enemies," she said. "Rest now, you look as though you need it." After the older woman had departed, Thomas and Joseph conferred quietly near the door, while Abigail helped Charlotte explore their temporary home. The little girl, initially wary of their new surroundings, quickly warmed to the cozy cabin and the soft furs that covered the sleeping platforms. "Mama, look!" she exclaimed, pointing to a small woven doll that had been placed on one of the beds, clearly left there for her by Singing Bird, or perhaps Grey Willow herself. "That was very thoughtful of them," Abigail said, touched by the gesture. "We must thank them properly later." Eventually, Joseph departed to make his own preparations for the journey to Cheyenne, leaving Thomas and Abigail alone while Charlotte played contentedly with her new doll and wooden animals. "You should copy the key now," Thomas suggested, nodding toward Abigail's locket. "We'll leave before dawn tomorrow." Abigail nodded, unclasping the locket and carefully extracting the small folded paper inside. Using a piece of bark and a charcoal stick provided by Singing Bird for the fire, she meticulously copied Edmund's poem, ensuring each word was exactly as written in the original. When she finished, she handed the copy to Thomas and returned the original to her locket. "Be careful with it," she said unnecessarily. "It's all we have." Thomas tucked the paper securely into an inner pocket of his coat. "We'll return as soon as we can," he promised. 3 days at most. "If we're not back by then—" "You will be," Abigail interrupted, unwilling to contemplate the alternative. Thomas held her gaze, his expression solemn. "If we're not," he continued, "Grey Willow knows of safe routes to the Canadian border. The tribes there would help you reach a settlement where you could start fresh." The reality of their situation, the persistent danger, the uncertain future, settled heavily on Abigail's shoulders. "Just come back," she said softly. "Both of you." Thomas nodded once the gesture containing both acknowledgement and promise. "Try to rest while we're gone," he advised, glancing at her pregnant form. "The child will come soon enough. You'll need your strength." That evening, the four of them shared a simple meal, brought by Singing Bird venison stew, corn cakes, and wild berries preserved from the fall harvest. Charlotte, initially hesitant about the unfamiliar food, was won over by the sweet berries and eventually tried everything else, much to Abigail's relief. As night fell, Joseph departed to sleep in his sister's teepee, leaving Abigail, Charlotte, and Thomas alone in the small cabin. Charlotte quickly succumbed to exhaustion, curled on one of the sleeping platforms with her wooden animals and new doll arranged protectively around her. Abigail and Thomas sat by the fire, the dancing flames casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across their faces. Neither spoke yet. The silence between them held a companionable quality, as if words had become superfluous to their understanding of each other. It was Thomas who finally broke the quiet. "I never thanked you," he said, his voice low to avoid waking Charlotte. "For what?" Abigail asked, surprised. "For trusting me," he replied simply, "when you had every reason not to." Abigail considered this, remembering their first meeting, her fear, his reticence, the mutual wariness of strangers in a dangerous world. "I could say the same to you," she pointed out. "You took us in when it would have been safer to turn us away." Thomas shook his head slightly. "Not safer," he corrected. "Easier, perhaps, but not safer. For the soul." The distinction touched something deep in Abigail, a recognition of the moral courage it had taken for this solitary man to open his door, his home, ultimately his heart, to their plight. "Whatever happens in Cheyenne," she said softly, "I want you to know that you've already done more than anyone could have expected. More than I had any right to ask." Thomas's expression remained impassive, but something in his eyes softened at her words. "There is no debt between us," he said, echoing Grey Willow's earlier statement. "Only choice." The simple declaration lingered in the air between them, weighted with meaning that extended beyond their current circumstances. Abigail found herself wondering what choices might be possible once their immediate crisis had passed, what futures might be imagined beyond the shadow of pursuit and danger. Before she could pursue this thought, Thomas rose and moved to the window, checking the night sky. "I should rest," he said. "Dawn comes early, and the road to Cheyenne is long." Abigail nodded, recognizing the shift in his demeanor from the briefly vulnerable man by the fire back to the focused protector preparing for the task ahead. "Of course," she said. "Good night, Thomas." He paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Good night, Abigail," he replied, her name carrying a gentleness in his voice that stayed with her long after he had gone. Dawn arrived with a pale, tentative light that seemed to hesitate at the cabin's small window. Abigail, who had slept little, was already awake when a soft knock announced Thomas and Joseph's arrival. They entered quietly, both dressed for travel, and carrying small packs containing only essentials. Charlotte stirred but didn't fully wake as Abigail rose to greet them. "You're leaving now," she whispered, noting the early hour. Thomas nodded. "While the camp still sleeps. Less attention that way." Abigail twisted her hands together, suddenly overwhelmed by the finality of this parting. "Please be careful," she said, the inadequate words catching in her throat. "We will return," Joseph assured her, his weathered face serene with confidence. "With what we seek." Thomas seemed about to add something when Charlotte's sleepy voice interrupted. "Going, Thomas?" she asked, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. He moved to her bedside, crouching to meet her at eye level. "For a little while," he confirmed. "You'll stay here with your mother until I come back." Charlotte considered this, her small brow furrowed in concentration. Then, with the decisive movement of a child who has made up her mind, she reached for one of her wooden animals, the eagle Thomas had carved, and pressed it into his hand. "For protect," she declared solemnly. Thomas stared at the small carving, momentarily speechless. Then, with equal solemnity, he tucked it into his coat pocket. "Thank you," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "I will keep it safe." Charlotte nodded, satisfied with this exchange, then promptly lay back down and closed her eyes, apparently content to return to sleep now that this important business was concluded. Thomas straightened his expression, carefully controlled, as he turned back to Abigail. "Gray Willow will look after you," he said. "Singing Bird speaks some English if you need anything." Abigail nodded, fighting the inexplicable urge to reach for him to create some physical connection before this parting. Instead, she simply said, "I'll be waiting." Something flickered in Thomas's eyes, a moment of decision perhaps, or recognition. Then in a movement so swift and unexpected it left her breathless, he stepped forward and placed a gentle hand against her cheek. "3 days," he promised, the words barely above a whisper. "Watch for us from the eastern ridge." Before Abigail could respond, he withdrew his hand and turned away, following Joseph through the door and into the gray light of early morning. She moved to the window, watching as their figures grew smaller, with distance eventually disappearing into the forest that bordered the eastern edge of the camp. Only then did she allow herself to acknowledge the warmth that lingered on her cheek and the curious mixture of fear and hope that had taken root in her heart.